Producers, artists, and supervisors use the Shotgun Web GUI to collaborate on projects. But the Web GUI can also help developers. We can use it to explore and manage Shotgun's Postgres database backend. Understanding how entity schemas underpin and drive functionality in the web app can inform decisions we make when modifying built-in entities or creating custom entities for studio-specific workflows. In this video, you'll learn how to view and change built-in entity fields, like the status field on the shot entity, how to create custom fields and custom entities, and why permissions play such a big role in all of this. First, let's talk about what an entity is in Shotgun and what separates one entity type from another. Here we have a short list of entities, an entity called SH001 and an entity called SH002. There are many different types of entities in Shotgun, but this page has been configured to only display entities of type shot. So we're looking at two shot entities. Said differently, entity SH001's type is shot in the database, and we can confirm that by running a Shotgun Python API command to pull down its database record. We'll cover the Shotgun Python API in other videos, so don't worry about learning the API syntax or commands now. I'm just showing this to help you understand what's going on in the database. Okay, so you can't change an entity's type or ID after it's been created. A shot will always be a shot. But you can change most other field values on an entity. So what exactly is a field? Let's head back to Shotgun. Right now we're looking at 8 fields on our shot entities: the thumbnail field, the shot code field, and the sequence, status, cut in, cut out, cut duration, and open notes fields. Each field can contain a value of a certain data type. For example, the shot code field can only contain a string value, and the cut in field can only contain an integer value. If I'm evil and I try to type a float value into an integer field, it will be truncated and sent to the database as an integer. So the web app will validate and clean user input before it's sent to the database. Let's take a look at the cut-in's field value in the database to make sure that's what happened. You may have noticed that I referred to the cut-in field in my API command here as sgcutin, but the name of the field over here in Shotgun is cut-in. What's up with that, right? Well, the field name that users see in Shotgun is what we call the display name. The display name can have capital letters, spaces, Unicode characters, etc., and by default, admin users can change it at any time. Super convenient, right? It's easy to read and it's flexible. But using a field's display name in code would be a nightmare for developers. So each field also has a permanent internal code that won't ever have spaces, uppercase letters, periods, hyphens, Unicode characters, etc. So how do we discover the internal code of a field? One way is to right-click on a field column header and choose Configure Field. In this case, we can see that the field with the display name of cut-in has an internal code of sgcutin. This is usually how I grab the internal code of a field, but in rare cases, you won't be able to get field information this way. For example, here with the Open Notes field. So for tricky cases like that, you can visit the Fields page in Shotgun, filter for the entity type and field name you're interested in, and grab the internal code from the field code value. By default, a subset of an entity's more important fields are displayed on entity pages, like our shots page here. If you'd like to promote a specific field that isn't visible, or all fields on an entity type, click on the Fields menu, then Configure Columns, choose what field you'd like to view, and click Apply. I'll just display all of them for now. Here we can see that the same field names come back from the database when we read the shot's entity type schema. The sum of the fields here is called the entity schema and essentially defines what our shot entities are, what they should be used to represent conceptually. Said different, folks in MyFake Studio have agreed that a shot entity is a thing that is part of a sequence, has a status, exists in relation to a cut, and so we have some fields that store cut frame values, and it contains assets, has a description, and so on. This collection of fields is also what differentiates shot entities at my studio from, say, asset entities, which are defined by a different set of fields, like type, parent asset, and sub-asset. Let's head back to the shots page. So, together, these fields can be used to store and communicate information about any number of shots in my project. Here at Shotgun, we've tried to anticipate which fields might be most useful for tracking shots, but of course you might not use some of these fields in your studio, or you might want to change a field, like the list of statuses here, and some fields your studio or project needs might be missing. So what do you do in those cases? Well, if you don't want to view or use a field, simply hide it away, easy. Or switch back to your studio's default view by choosing Revert Page from the Page Settings menu. If you need to change a field, that's also easy. Just click on the Fields menu, choose Configure Field, and adjust the field's attributes. To add a field, click on the Fields menu, choose Manage Shot Fields, click Add New Field, choose a data type. I want a Boolean, so I'll choose checkbox. Add a display name, click Next, and then Create Field. As an aside, if I choose only the current project here, our field will still be available for all projects from the API. It just won't be visible to them in the GUI. And you can change that later. But it's generally good practice to create fields that will work with all your projects, if possible. Let's take a look at the internal name of our new field. You can see that my bizarre display name has been sanitized. And if I want to access our new field with the API, I use the sanitized display name. There you go. It's also good practice to visit the Fields page after creating a new field and add a description to it that includes the date the field was created, who created it, and what its intended use is. It's very easy to create a ton of fields quickly when defining workflows, and you can end up with a mess, especially if there are multiple admins creating fields who aren't in constant contact. The info in the description here can really help internal coordination during a cleanup effort. So we've learned what an entity type is, a collection of fields that define a concept, like shot or asset. We've learned how to show or hide entity fields, either by controlling their visibility for the entire project or current page, and how to create new fields. I want to briefly note that you can also delete fields, but we don't recommend deleting the default fields Shotgun ships with. In fact, admins don't have permission by default to delete many of them. But feel free to delete fields that you or other admins create if the stakeholders at your studio agree they aren't needed anymore. To do that, simply send them to the trash. And to permanently delete them, visit the Fields page in the trash and choose Delete Forever. You may need to do this at some point due to a naming conflict. Note that fields are the only entity type in Shotgun you can permanently delete. So far, we've looked at the shot entity and the asset entity, both of which are project-based entities. That means their project field can't be empty. It must always point to a project. If we're evil and try to clear out the project field, we get this red warning box and an error message if we float over it. And if I refresh the page, the previous value is restored. The same evil is prevented in the API. Okay, so what's an example of a non-project-based entity type? Well, project entities themselves, ironically, belong to a non-project entity type. You wouldn't nest one project under another, right? Here's another one, people. You'll likely want to assign the same person entity to multiple projects to avoid duplicating person entities. So person entities can't exist in only one project. But don't worry, we can use filters to narrow down the list of people in the current project. For example, if I navigate to the People page from the project navigation bar, we're presented with a page configured to list the 4 people linked to this project. You can see that in the filters here. But if we navigate to the People page from the Site navigation bar, all 5 active people on our Shotgun site are listed, even those who don't have a value in their projects field. Let's take a look at one of these people in the database, maybe the teacher account here. Oops, it looks like something is wrong with our query. The error message is telling me that person isn't an entity type our database recognizes. What gives? Well, just like fields, entities have display names the GUI uses, names that can contain spaces or special characters, or that might change during production. To find the permanent internal name of an entity type, you can check the Entities section on the Site Preferences page. I'll search for person, and there it is. So the internal name of the person entity is human user. Note that not all entity types are listed on this page. In rare cases, the only way to discover the internal name of an entity type is by running the API's schema entity read function, or by scanning through error messages like this. Some examples of other sneaky entity types are the pipeline step, note, and reply entity types. Let's run our find command again and sub in human user for person. Cool, now it works. So, it's important, as a developer, to know the difference between non-project entities, like the people entity, that may show up in project pages simply because a filter is active, and project-based entities, like shot and asset, that can only ever be accessed from within one project at a time. The best way to think about it is, project-based entities are for tracking things your team builds, and non-project entities are for tracking who uses your Shotgun site and how they use it. Let's take a look at other entities that are important to developers. Event log entries, that's a good place to start. Everything that happens in Shotgun is recorded with event log entry entities. We know what happened, who did it, when it happened. There's even some handy links to related entities. And like all entities in Shotgun, event log entries are available from the API. Super useful. But wait a minute. These are just events related to the Hyperspace Madness project. What about things that happen to global non-project entities? Where are those events stored? That's a great question. If you look around, you won't find it. WTF. Okay, fine. Shotgun doesn't ship with a global event log entry page, so let's make one. We can just create a new page, select the entity type we're interested in, event log entries in this case, and clear out the project field. There we go. Now we can see all the events on our site, not just the project-related events. And FYI, you can use that trick for any entity type, so you could create a global page that tracked all assets on your site, if that was useful. The last thing to do is decide whether we want our new page to be public. I'll let other admins see it. Okay, cool. Event log entry entities, fun stuff. What else? Well, what about the page we're looking at? Here's the page ID and the URL. Let's see what info we can get from its page entity. All kinds of stuff. What project it's linked to, who updated it last, whether it's shared or not. Hopefully you're starting to understand that nearly everything in Shotgun is an entity and can be queried from the API. To really drive that point home, let's take a look at statuses. Remember that status field we had so much fun with on the shot entity? Here it is. Well, each of the statuses in this list is itself an entity, which we can see by visiting the statuses page. I can add a new status field to the status entity type, and then query it from the API, same as any other entity. Another important entity type that you might not realize is available as you get deeper into development is the local storages entity type. If you've set up your Shotgun site to publish files to a specific location on disk, that information can be queried via the local storage entity. External scripts can be tracked as entities too. Why not keep a registry of all Python scripts that access your Shotgun site, right? You'll learn about script keys later, but Python scripts have their own authentication credentials, which are stored here. You can add detailed descriptions so that other users know what your scripts do, and of course you can always extend the script entity to track other info related to development. Maybe add a department field to track who owns the script, or a link field to store a documentation URL. Pipeline steps are also entities and files that have been uploaded to Shotgun, and software. These could all become more useful to your development by extending their field sets. Hopefully I've made my point. It behooves you to take a good long look at the list of built-in, non-project, system-level entities. You'll be surprised by the quantity and variety of data that's out there for the picking, and you'll be better at solving problems creatively if you're familiar with it. Before we move on, I'll note two exceptions to this rule. Although fields are tracked as entities in Shotgun, some functionality is restricted. For example, you can't add a field to a field entity. You also can't use the standard find API calls to access fields. For that, we have a separate set of schema API commands, which we'll talk about later. The second exception is permissions. It's currently not possible to set permissions from the API. We've learned that nearly everything users interact with in Shotgun belongs to a customizable entity type that can be accessed from the database with an API. That's a ton of flexibility and access. But we aren't satisfied yet, are we? We want even more flexibility. What if none of the built-in entities can be extended in a practical way to represent the sort of thing you're interested in tracking? What if you're working on a project that is so different from a film or game that few of the built-in entities make sense? In those cases, you can enable custom entities. Here's how you do that. Head over to the Site Preferences page and open the Entities tab. Entities that are currently enabled on this Shotgun site are displayed in black, while disabled entities are displayed in gray. There are three types of custom entities: regular old custom entities, custom non-project entities, and custom threaded entities. Let's look at custom entities first. There is a fixed number of them, 50. That should be more than enough for any sort of project you're working on. Usually it's a bad sign if folks have more than 10 or 15 custom entities enabled, especially for film or games projects that we support out of the box. But what if you have a ton of moving pieces? Well, there are clever strategies for handling situations like that. For example, the built-in asset entity can be used to track characters, props, environments, weapons, vehicles, simply because it has a type field. The moral is, it's always a good idea to look at the existing enabled entities and determine if they can be extended, without making a mess, before enabling a new custom entity. In my case, I'd like to keep track of which camera lens I used on each shot of my film, and it seems impractical to add things like f-stop range, lens brand, and focal length to any of the existing entities. So I'll enable custom entity 01 and call it camera lens. Now if I go to my project, you can see that our camera lens entity type shows up in the Other menu, and has been populated with some default fields: camera lens name, description, status, and so on. If I create a camera lens entity, you can see that, just like the other project-based entities, the project field can't be empty. This entity type is now essentially a blank slate that we can add fields to. I'll add a brand field to start. And of course, I can query my new field from the API. But what is the internal name of our camera lens entity type? Any guesses? It's custom entity 01, and it'll always be custom entity 01, which is nice because I could create and reference a constants library file. This way, code can refer to the camera lens entity instead of custom entity 01, and our code will be easier to read. Now if I want to link my new camera lens to the cameras it can be used with, and the shots it's been used in, I can add fields on those entity types, type in my lens name, and away we go. It's the same drill for adding a custom non-project entity and a custom threaded entity. Of course, with custom non-project entities, you may want to create a global page, like we did with the All Event Log Entries page. As we've seen, the Shotgun Web GUI is a powerful tool that gives developers access to Shotgun's Postgres database. If we wanted to, we could drastically change or ignore many of the built-in project-based entities and instead opt to build data networks from scratch using only custom entities. But let's not go down that thought hole just yet. We'd be throwing away a ton of functionality. The closer you can get to Shotgun's out-of-the-box workflows, the more it'll pay off. What Shotgun ships with, it's not just a collection of default entity types. It's also a suite of web and desktop tools built around specific entity types and workflows. Those tools and workflows can be customized to some extent, but it's a good idea to become familiar with them before making decisions to modify or abandon an entity type. The playlist, cut, task, version, file, and publish entity types are all good examples of entity types at the heart of built-in workflows. For example, the tasks entity is intimately linked to the schedule in Shotgun. The publish entity is used by Toolkit to track dependencies between files on your file system. The cut-related entities are used in the media player and RV, and the playlist and version entities are used pretty much everywhere media is reviewed. A lot of hard work has gone into creating powerful and intuitive tools based on these entities, and I encourage you to become familiar with them before making large decisions related to entity schemas. As a developer, it's essential that you understand the role permissions play in relation to entities and fields. Every action a user takes to view, change, create, or delete an entity or its fields is permitted or refused by the permissions framework. You may have noticed some permissions options in the Site Preferences page here. These can help you control access to entire entities, but for total control, head over to the Permissions page. Here you'll find a permissions role-centric GUI that provides the same control over entity access, but also more granular control over field permissions. So, for example, if I don't want admin users, like myself, to see the cut-in field on shots, I can turn it off here. Now when I navigate to my project's shot page, I won't see that field. And if I try to access it from the API, nothing is returned. This is an especially important part of the Web GUI because, like I mentioned earlier, viewing and setting permissions from the API is not currently supported, so you'll want to get familiar with the workflow in the GUI. Finally, I'll note that it is possible to create conditional permissions rules, but it's pretty complicated, so we prefer to do it for you. If you think you need to create conditional permissions, get in touch with Shotgun support and we'll hook you up.